Tonight, we bear witness to a civilization in the process of electrifying political change. Soon will be the anniversary of Iran's stolen elections. The Iranian-American scholar and commentator Reza Aslan, author of No God But God and How to Win a Cosmic War, opens our festival with his address, Iran, A New Beginning. I came across Reza on a trip to the United States last year. Aslan, part of a large Iranian diaspora in Los Angeles that sometimes sees it referred to as Tehrangeles, has become the leading commentator on Iran on CNN, perhaps even more influentially on The Daily Show and The Colbert Report. Last December, when it became clear that the protests in Iran were not just about the elections, but included larger questions about democracy and individual liberty and control by the people of their own destiny, Aslan was one of a handful of key commentators I used to see tweeting and getting critical information and passing on critical information on to journalists in the Western media who couldn't otherwise get access to that information. He's the member of the Council of Foreign Relations, a scholar of religions, and a former fellow of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. He also writes and speaks with clarity about what is perhaps one of the most emotionally and politically charged issues of our day, our response to terrorism and radical religion. But tonight, he will talk to us about Iran and its new beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Reza Aslan.
Thank you. What a great pleasure it is to be here in this beautiful city, and thank you all for coming out on this wet and windy Sydney night. Turns out everything I was told about this city is a lie. It is a great pleasure to be here, and especially to talk about this important issue of Iran and the new beginning that it faces. You know, in 1979, in a crisp February morning, I remember taking my 4-year-old sister by the hand and, forgetting to ask permission of my mother, going out of our North Tehran apartment and going out onto the streets to take part in the revelry that was taking place at the time. After months of violence and bloodshed, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, was finally forced into exile. And on that morning, the champion of the revolution, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, had arrived. Now, I say that I didn't ask permission of my mother. That's not exactly true. I'm a good son. I did ask her if I could go, and she said, Inshallah. Now, for those of you Aussies who don't know what this important term means, Inshallah, it's literally translated as God willing. But it's a kind of a variable term. It's sort of what, like we Angelinos, how we use the term dude, which can really mean anything depending on how you say it. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on this important term, Inshallah. So for instance, if you walk into the Sydney Theatre and you ask, is this where Reza Aslan is speaking? And they say, Inshallah, that means yes. If you get into a cab and you say, please take me to the Sydney Theatre, and the cab driver says, Inshallah, that means maybe. We may get there, we may not get there. If you ask your mother, Mom, can I take my 4-year-old sister to take part in a bloody revolution on the streets of Tehran? And she says, Inshallah, that means no. So I took her Inshallah to mean yes. I went out there to take part in this incredible expression of popular will. You know, there's a real misconception about what this revolution was about. Part of it has to do with the way we even talk about it as the Islamic Revolution. This was not an Islamic revolution. That's a post-revolutionary propaganda. This was a revolution that swept up entire sectors of Iranian society, wide coalitions of intellectuals and secularists, Marxists, communists, the religious clerics, both the conservative and the liberals, Muslims, Jews, Christians, men, women. Every sector of Iranian society took part in this uprising, which, had less to do with what they had in common with each other, and they had very little in common with each other, except for this one thing that they all agreed upon, that the Shah must go. And on this February morning, the Shah had gone. I remember my sister and I stole a pitcher of Tang. You remember Tang? Stole a pitcher of Tang from my mother and some Dixie cups and went out there and filled these Dixie cups and passed them out to the revolutionaries who were celebrating the triumph of their work and of their bloodshed. And I remember that there was this sort of celebration in the air. Strangers would stop and pick you up and kiss you on the cheeks. People were throwing handfuls of sweets outside of windows. And I remember hearing these incredibly powerful words whose meanings I didn't really understand, but who I understood that there was something mystifying, something unexplained about them. Words like freedom and liberty and democracy. And a few months later, after that fateful morning, the promise of those words seemed to be fulfilled when Iran's provisional government drafted a new constitution for a newly formed and thrillingly titled Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, the Constitution was a combination of third world anti-imperialism and traditional Shiite populism. Its founding articles promised equality of the sexes, religious pluralism, freedom of speech, social justice, the right to peaceful assembly, all of the things, the principles that the revolution had fought for. And it also simultaneously affirmed the Islamic character of the new republic. In fact, in some ways, this new Constitution of 79 looked a lot like the Constitution of 1905, the revolution of 1905 that created a constitutional monarchy in Iran in the first place. And it certainly relied on the revolution of 1953, the nationalist revolution of Mohammad Mossadegh. We Iranians, if you haven't figured it out yet, are quite fond of our revolutions. 3 in a century so far. But there was something unusual about this particular constitution, because it seemed to envisage two governments. One government was meant to represent the popular sovereignty of the people, the will of the people. It envisioned a democratically elected president, an independent judiciary, a parliament that would make laws. And then there was this second shadow government, a government that was meant to represent divine sovereignty, the sovereignty of God. And that government essentially consisted of just one man, a man who would be called the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, the thing about the supreme leader you have to understand is that originally it was supposed to be just kind of a pope-like figure, a figurehead, if you will, the representation of the Islamic moral values upon which the state would be founded. The supreme leader wasn't meant to have any kind of direct political authority, certainly political influence. But in the coming years and through the machinations of Iran's very powerful clerical establishment, the position of the supreme leader went from a figurehead to the single most powerful political position in the country. In fact, the Constitution ultimately would provide the supreme leader with the power to dissolve the parliament, to dismiss the president, to veto any law he wished, to be the commander-in-chief of the military. In other words, although it was originally intended to reconcile popular and divine sovereignty, the Constitution had, perhaps unwittingly, paved the way for the institutionalization of absolute clerical control. But on that February morning, no one was thinking this far ahead. We were all far too euphoric for that. We were waiting for a new beginning. This was supposed to be the new beginning. And despite what the Constitution offered, the truth is that at that time, the debate, the discussion, the arguments over what the Islamic Republic was supposed to be, what the meaning and the function of it was going to be, had just begun. It was a vibrant discussion, a vibrant debate in post-revolutionary Iran about what this new beginning is going to look like. A debate that unfortunately came to an end a few months later when, encouraged by the United States and ultimately provided with weapons from the United States, chemical and biological weapons, Saddam Hussein decided to invade Iran. And I don't need to tell you Aussies what happens in times of war. All debates and discussions and dissent are put away, and power is usually formalized in the hands of a single individual. In the case of Iran, of course, that would be the Ayatollah Khomeini. And so, the dream that had given rise to a revolution a year earlier gave way to the reality of a totalitarian state plagued by the gross ineptitude of a ruling clerical regime wielding unconditional religious and political authority. It's been 3 decades since that February morning, and a lot has happened. There's been wars, conflicts, violence, and the debate over the meaning and function of not just that revolution, but of the Islamic Republic has still been waiting for that new beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that that new beginning is here. It was launched a year ago. And it was launched by a coalition that looks a lot like the coalition that brought down the Shah 30 years ago. A coalition made up of young secularists and old theocrats. A coalition made up of intellectuals from North Tehran and Isfahan and lower-class peasants from Mashhad and Tabriz. A coalition made up of the people who actually fought the revolution and gave birth to the Islamic Republic, and those for whom the revolution is really at this point nothing more than empty promises and meaningless slogans. This is the Green Movement that we've all been hearing about. Now, in the spirit of the Sydney Writers' Festival and our motto for this week, read, rethink, and respond, I'm here to tell you that absolutely everything you think you know about the Green Movement is wrong. It's time to rethink it, though maybe you could hold your response for later. Number one, this notion that this is a movement of a bunch of disaffected kids. Wrong. This is a movement that has swept up, again, almost every sector of Iranian society. Yes, there are kids, but at the same time, there are people who actually, as I said, gave birth to the Islamic Republic. Number two, this is a movement that is just too eclectic, too diverse of a coalition to be successful in any meaningful way. Wrong. In fact, it is precisely the diversity, the eclecticism of this movement that gives it its strength. It doesn't matter that the only thing that they have in common with each other is that they know that this government must go. That is where they draw their strength. Number three, this movement has no hope because it's leaderless. It's true, it is leaderless, but it's wrong that that is a weakness. That may have been a weakness 30, 40 years ago, but in the internet age, when you have Twitter and YouTube, you don't need leaders any longer. This is the true definition of a popular uprising. If you don't believe me, recall that on numerous occasions, the so-called leaders of this movement, Mir Hussein Mousavi, the man who lost the election to Ahmadinejad, Mehdi Karoubi, the other person who ran for the office, former President Mohammad Khatami, on numerous occasions, they actually they sent out communiques to the Green Movement telling them not to protest because it was too dangerous. And on every single case in which they said that, the protests were actually larger than they would have been otherwise. This is a movement that doesn't need any leadership. And fourth and most important, the sort of mainstream media's attempt to tell you that this movement is dead and buried, crushed under the weight of the oppression of this regime is wrong. In fact, since we are at a writers' festival, let me paraphrase the great Mark Twain by saying that the reports of the demise of the Green Movement have been greatly exaggerated. On the contrary, in fact, I would go so far as to say that the Green Movement has been enormously successful. They have won. They have actually done what they ultimately set out to do, which was not, as so many people outside of Iran thought, or I should say hoped, they were supposed to be doing, which is bringing down the regime. But instead, their ultimate goal was to delegitimize the regime, to delegitimize the Islamic Republic. And that's precisely what they have done. What do I mean by this? Well, you have to understand that from the beginning, the Islamic Republic has based its legitimacy on two fundamental pillars. The first is that the regime sets itself up as the locus of Islamic morality in the state. It is the source from which the moral values of the Islamic Republic are supposed to come. This is a very important part of its legitimacy. And indeed, it's a powerful, powerful message, particularly to what Iranians sometimes refer to as the pious classes. This is that very large 50 million or so lower middle class Iranians who are, for the most part, apolitical, not very socially conscious, but who nevertheless see the state as the source for their moral foundation, their morality. Well, the brutality of the response of this regime to unarmed men, women, and children on the street, the way that they violently attacked some of the most senior religious figures, the most important religious figures in the country, the widespread reports of torture and rape and murder in Iran's sadistic prisons, all of these things have completely shattered the notion that the state is the locus of morality. In fact, sometimes we think that this whole Green Movement is a movement of secularists against the religious, ideology of the state. That's actually quite false. 5 of the 6 remaining Grand Ayatollahs in Iran. Grand Ayatollah is the absolute highest level of religious authority that a cleric in Shia Islam can attain. 5 of the 6 have either openly rejected the Ahmadinejad regime or, in an unprecedented move, refused to give it its blessing. The 7th one, Ayatollah Ali Montazeri, was the leader of the Green Movement, and he unfortunately passed away a few months ago. The highest religious authority in Iran, which, by the way, is not the supreme leader. The supreme leader is the highest political authority in Iran. The highest religious authority in Iran, the Grand Ayatollah Sana'i, actually issued a fatwa declaring it a mortal sin to accept the outcome of the elections of last June. The moral, religious foundation of the state is gone. Now, part of this has to do with a very complicated issue that we're not going to talk about too much here, but it has to do with the rise of the Revolutionary Guard and the militarization of Iranian politics. You must understand that something profound is taking place in Iran right now. Iran is in the process of transforming from a theocratic state to a military dictatorship. And it's up to you whether you think that's a good or a bad thing. I suppose it depends on your ideology. But Ahmadinejad has, over the last 5 years, systematically removed anyone wearing a turban in a position of power and replaced them with somebody who either is currently or was quite recently wearing the uniform of a Revolutionary Guard member. Ahmadinejad himself, of course, is a member of the Revolutionary Guard. In fact, the most interesting aspect of Ahmadinejad's regime is that he is beginning to gradually distance himself from the religious authorities, made a very interesting comment a few months ago in which he said, quote, "Administering the country should not be left to the supreme leader, the religious scholars, or the other clerics." This military takeover of Iran has essentially taken away, as I say, that religious authority. The patina of religious morality has been scraped away. And all that's left now, even for those pious masses, all that's left now is the reality of a military police state.